Hey everyone, welcome back to Unwrap with Shopes. And today we're going to be dealing with a very interesting topic that's really close to my heart. That is games. And with me today, I have Dr. Paul Darvasi, who is a professor at University of Toronto and is specialized with games and learning. But he also does another thing, which is his main gig actually. And I'm going to pass it on to Paul to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Paul Darvasi, and as thank you for that very kind introduction. So I run a studio called Goldbug Interactive, where we create digital games and media, largely for humanitarian agencies. We've worked with the United Nations, large NGO clusters. We work with universities and museums. We're interested in working at all types of intersections of games and learning, everything from gamified workshops to creating digital games to save the world.
Perfect. I think, Paul, you cover the three things that I actually love. That's games, education, and social justice. So
Right.
today we're just going to begin with 5 quick questions, just to give people a glimpse into how games help in the everyday lives of all of us, right? So to begin with, what does gamification of learning even mean?
So it's interesting because gamification is a term that's often applied when you're using games in a non-game environment. But I like to think of it more as game-based learning because gamification tends to focus on the reward mechanisms as opposed to creating games itself. And there, it's a broad question because you can use games as artifacts for learning, the same way that you would use a textbook or more traditional artifacts for learning. I'm particularly interested in how games can help us rethink school and learning structures. So how can we learn from games? They're very dynamic, they're participatory, they're engaging, and they have an incredible array of strategies in order to accomplish what they accomplish. And because games are systems and schools are systems, what can we borrow from the game world to make school a better place?
Thank you for that, Paul. So based on what you just said, so in my experience, I feel that games are great, but they also take up a lot of time, right? When you're planning a particular activity around games. So what is the feasibility of games in formal education? So in a public school system?
Right. So there are, of course, challenges to implementing games in public schools, particularly high caliber video game or due to digital divide and issues of technology. But I would argue that it's, as you say, it can be time consuming because often you're breaking new ground or doing something a little differently when you're implementing games, but the rewards are enormous. And games really are attuned to our time. I mean, we live in an interactive, participatory culture. We're interested in artificial intelligence. We're interested in the metaverse, and games are a springboard for all of these things, but they don't have to be technologically demanding. A creative teacher can turn their class into a game and offer points and create missions and that type of thing. Or you can bring in a board game and have people play and discuss and think about, you did this and that, and how does that relate to some historical situation? So I feel there are many, many avenues, and it's a much more natural fit than we might think because play and learning have been tied since the earliest days of human evolution, and games are only a form of designed play. So in a way, we're recapturing or recuperating a form of learning which I think has been lost by more industrialized school systems.
Yes, definitely. And with this segment, I remember that during a class that I took under you, you did a very creative thing with high school students and games. Would you like to give us a gist of what you incorporated into the curriculum?
Yeah, hard to encapsulate in a few words, but essentially I took the story of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a novel by Ken Kesey, which takes place in a men's asylum in Oregon. And I created that world for my students. So for a month, my students were put into the role of the patients, and they had missions, and there were propaganda videos, and everybody was doing something a little different. And it was essentially an experiment to see what does it look like when you create an immersive game as a learning event. And it was astonishingly successful in that they worked very hard, they were highly engaged, learning became instantly differentiated, and that experiment absolutely convinced me that one of the ways out of the kind of rut that we're in with the traditional education system is using games as a way to think about education.
This brings me to the question. So, in most circumstances that I have been in, at least, people talk about how games help with critical thinking and creative thinking skills, right? Would you like to tell us a little bit about how games can actually help with mental health as well?
Oh, absolutely. So there are many, many, many games now. I mean, if you don't know anything about video games, you probably, the first word that comes to mind is violence, antisocial, all of these kind of, media. And all those things are true, right? There are violent games. There are antisocial people who play games. There are issues with people, becoming addicted to games, but addiction issues tend to be through pre-existing dispositions and life situations. And a game is one outlet for addiction, much like smoking or alcohol or drugs or whatever the case may be. But what I think may be surprising is there's a whole array of games, thousands of games out there, and many of them can focus on very powerful experiences that allow us to reflect, that allow us to grow, that allow us to understand through rehearsal the importance of something like resilience, right? That you have to fail sometimes to move forward, that it's okay to fall down and to pick yourself back up again. And games teach us that better than many other media, because they allow you to rehearse and participate, and there are consequences to your actions. And when you're trying to teach that to young people in terms of ethics and morals and how you find your place in the world, games can be very powerful tools, particularly if well contextualized. Most of the time, the game does not do all of the work. And even the best intentioned games don't necessarily achieve their objectives just by playing the game. But if you combine a game with a curricular structure that supports the ideas, whether it's empathy, whether it's resilience, any of these sort of characteristics that we look for when we're thinking about social and emotional development, games can be very, very powerful tools, very powerful artifacts to advance that agenda.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. How can educators incorporate games in the smallest ways, right, in their everyday practice?
Yeah, so anything, right? I mean, we've been using games in education forever. All right, we have a teacher that plays hangman. You draw it on the board, and might help with spelling. It might be a nice way to entertain your students. So you start from that end of the spectrum. You have card games, board games. In my class, we design games at the end of the class, and there's always these wonderful games that reinforce vocabulary, that support language learning, that are designed and created by the teachers. And these are paper and pencil games. And I find that there's always, teachers don't think that they're designers or creators, or that this is possible, but all it takes is a little bit of effort and a little bit of a push. So you have, that part of the spectrum. Then it's using commercially available board games, and using them in a way, and again, contextualizing what's going on in the board game so you can turn it into an instructional moment or a teachable moment. And then you have all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where you have virtual reality and sort of commercial video games that can be used to teach anything from second language to history, to even supporting, literature and English in a way that is really powerful and relevant to a generation that's really used to interacting with their stories as opposed to passively consuming them.
To wrap it up, I have like a quick rapid fire, if that's okay. Just
of course, yeah.
So my first question would be, one board game that you would recommend that all of us have to try out?
Oh, that's so hard. We are in the golden age of board games. There are thousands and thousands of them out there. It'd be really difficult for me to pin one down. What? So I've recently played. I mean, it depends. I recently have been playing a game called Root. It's an asymmetrical game that takes place in a forest, and different animal characters have different values, and you're in competition to take over space and dominate the other. So it's a bit of a domination sort of war game, but it's really clever and fun, and it takes a little bit to pick up because there's some complexities there. But I absolutely love it. But on the simpler end of this, of the game or the board game world, I'd say something like Sushi Go is a lot of fun, right? Where you can sit there and play and collect cards and just to pass the time. I honestly, there's such a variety of games with so many different topics, mechanics, that I would just recommend people do their homework, search on, Game Board Geek or something, and look at games and how they're rated and what they're about to find what makes sense for them.
Thanks for that. And second, For people who've just started off into game designing, right? One online tool that you would recommend we definitely explore.
So in order to
Create a
start,
game. Yeah, to start.
yeah, I'm a huge fan of Twine. I feel it's an open source software that can, many games are designed on it. It's typically your starting point with Twine is creating choose your own adventure stories, right? Where you can create a narrative and allow your players to follow different paths depending on your decisions. And what's beautiful about Twine is that it's free, it's open. It has an enormous community of supporters. It is incredibly easy to learn, but it also allows for a great deal of complexity as you evolve in your knowledge of the tool.
And finally, one book that you would recommend people pick up if they want to understand how games help human beings.
So the first one that comes to mind, it's a little bit outdated. It was published in 2011, would be Jane McGonigal's Reality is Broken. And just, I feel that she does a very good job of, one, being accessible to a wide audience, and two, really showing the power of games in a way that may surprise people. So it's a bit of a page turner and you can absorb a lot. And then the other one, which is sort of the Bible in the games and learning world, is What Video Games Can Teach Us About Learning and Literacy by Dr. James Paul Gee, who is a former linguist who only started getting into the space of thinking about games and education in his 50s, and basically revolutionized the field.
This wraps up all the questions that I had, and I hope all of you take away some bits of information.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to chat with you, and I hope that this is helpful to anybody out there.